In this episode, we pick up directly where we left off, discussing Abolition of Man with Dr. Pinkoski, elaborating upon the Tao as a shared moral heritage which connects reason, passion, and sentiments to reality. And we delve into the implications of shaping society outside of the Tao, or the Way. So we witness this in Mao's Cultural Revolution, as well as the embrace of materialism in the West. And there we consider as well the propensity of those who leverage the power of the state outside of the Tao to make man in man's own image.
And not just our heritage in the sense that we all came up with it together and it tells us something collectively about ourselves, but that it's our, you alluded to this, it's our collective intuitions about the world, right? I mean,
precisely.
Like we all know that our reason, well, most people know that our reason connects us to reality. Most of us know that our passions connect us to reality. We're hungry, so there must be food. But we don't always recognize that our sentiments might connect us to reality too.
Yeah.
And what I get from Lewis is that actually, in fact, it does. Like our intuitions about aesthetics and things like that tell us something about the real world external to ourselves in a similar way to how both our rational and what you call instinctual tendencies also tell us something about the world. So
yeah, precisely. And that's how and that's again comes back to the task of the educator, right? We could use lofty or significant moral examples for that, but it's also, I think, just if we think more intuitively about, say, how you are educated to become a good cook, right? Someone teaches you that's too much salt. It tastes off. Something's off with the recipe, right? This is the right amount of salt that you need, or these are the kinds of spices that add these particular flavors, and you look for those sorts of flavors, right? So you're training your chest at that stage, right? And a good educator does that a fortiori, right? In more significant aesthetic and moral judgments.
Yeah. So that's the part of the idea there is not, so what you might get if you have an abolition of man mentality is that what educators do is they teach you what to like and what not to like. But it might be more precise to say that we're already by nature oriented to recognize goodness and beauty and truth. And what education does is it, well, as the name implies, it draws that out. Like it forms that natural talent that's already there. For example, someone might instinctively recognize that a tree is beautiful, but not recognize why the Iliad is beautiful.
Right.
Now they have the capacity to. It's actually the same. They both come from the chest. But once it's been presented, or the Divine Comedy or something, once it's been presented and explained, and like Virgil, you've guided the pilgrim through that, right? That forms that natural, you're not instilling it as some kind of external thing that you're putting into the student, but in fact, you're drawing out what is naturally there and educating and forming it like the chef, introducing new recipes, but again, not to brainwash, but to draw out an instinct that's already there. Now, if you don't believe there's anything that's naturally good or bad, then all education becomes telling students what to think, or in some ways, or telling them how to think, which is actually a form of telling students what to think. And that opens the door then for, if you already think all education is a kind of brainwashing, then what's the harm in brainwashing? Right. That's
just more of the same.
Just in a different direction. Although, like you mentioned, any value that people have is derived from the Tao, ultimately.
Yeah, so I don't know if we could come back to that a little bit, but I mean, what you're just saying there kind of reminds us of Socrates, the midwife, right? Who's bringing birth to stuff that you already know. Again, that's more perhaps the nous, the intellect, where Lewis is also pointing out the heart, right? This important component as well, right? So if we're going to place that in an area of primacy, but nonetheless, so the Tao is, so this is, you mentioned internal mechanism. I almost always want to think of it as an objective, transcendent, positive entity beyond the human interiority. Like, so I guess the connection, trying to think, I mean, really it's in mere Christianity, I think, that he's going to run with this and point you in that direction. Like, what is that internal thing where you think, oh, someone took my seat on the underground, oh, that's wrong for a reason.
He gives quite a good example here, which is, he says, ironically, for the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, I don't like the company of small children, and I know there's something wrong with that.
Right. Yeah.
Now, it's not really reason that's telling him that, right? It's not really his belly that's telling him that either, right? There's some other like sentiment that's saying there's something off about the fact that I don't enjoy the company of small children.
Right.
There's
Okay.
some aesthetic appreciation that I should be having and that I'm not. And that's a deficiency in me, not in the Tao and not in the small children.
Right. Well, I guess another way of asking the question then, so that deficiency that you recognize, you experience that internally, but it comes from the Tao, right? So I guess another way of asking is like, what is the Tao then? So what exactly is it? What
are educators educating into, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I mean, he does leave it quite open-ended in how this could be construed and so on. Like I think almost of maybe too modern of a sense would be like the Jungian collective unconscious, right? So this is something that's built in us, whether it's by biology or maybe some transcendent source, but it's just we have the same dreams, the same ideas, because it's collectively within our human realm. So that in that sense, it is somewhat subjective, but we share it because we share human nature. Or is it something rather that is above and beyond just you and I and our collective past, that it exists, that is communicating to us through the thumos, right?
Well, I have a theory, but I want to know what Dr.
Okay, yeah. So,
well, look, I think it's in this context, Lewis is keeping open all those possibilities. I had a third one, an anthropological one. This is sort of where the appendix points. We could look at various human societies and notice similarities in terms of the way that they articulate certain moral principles. And it seems like certain subjects keep coming up. Certain kinds of actions are known to be or named as impermissible actions. So we can have a kind of anthropological, empirical observation, the kind of things that gets Kantians in a riff. But there are different ways to proceed to understand ethics. But you can proceed by getting the grasp of that. And Lewis's point here is not I'm going to provide you with the justification for this. I'm going to provide you with the ontological source of this. It's rather to note that there is this shared inheritance that has been passed along, that exists in a number of different places, and that's all I have to get you to commit to understand the problem that we see from the Green Book. And the problem, and also the revolution that is implied by taking the attitude in the Green Book further. Another unstated premise, this is an Augustinian one. It's one that is nicely brought out in Introduction to Christianity, Joseph Ratzinger's book, about what one of the presuppositions of Christianity are. Receiving precedes making. That my fundamental state as a human being is to be in a world where I respond to what is already there. And if I deny that, and our dare I say, our enemies in the Schmittian sense, right, who write the Green Book, are denying that, then there are actually two ways we can develop that. I hope we get to that in the third one. So if we don't, remind me, and we'll bring that up, how it's a full articulation of the enemy. The real, there's a human enemy, and then there's the real enemy. Comes up in the third part. But okay, close the brackets off, and let's bring it back to this Augustinian point that Ratzinger brings up: receiving precedes making. If I negate that and follow the logic of that negation through, then I am putting myself in a position that is wholly outside what the Tao is, and implicitly, and Lewis thinks some people do make it explicit, making the claim that I can create everything for myself. I can make the world for me.
So very similar to the temptation of Eden. In
Yeah.
some sense, yes. That's offered. I wonder what you think of this, Dr. Pinkoski and Dr. McLarney, and I'm the only non-doctor here, so I'll defer to both of you.
You're almost
the
doctor. Yeah.
I think there are two reasons why Lewis uses the word, at least two reasons, one of which is really interesting and ironic, given that this is written in 1943, why he uses the term Tao.
Right. Okay.
And one of them is that it's very similar in Taoism, and the term is in Confucianism too, but there's multiple Taos. We all have these ways we're supposed to act in society and towards each other, and especially towards our superiors. Taoism goes behind all of that, right? And says there's a kind of Tao that's fundamental to the universe itself. And the word Tao means way, right? It's a path on which you walk. Now, I think the reason why Lewis chooses that is a couple of reasons. One is to say that this cultural heritage is not to say this is the way we all do things. It's actually a way it's a path you're supposed to walk. It's something that's pre-made. It's something you're supposed to literally follow. And Lewis is implicitly saying, it's not me saying that, it's everyone saying that. That's what we recognize it as being, is a path that we follow along. But also, the Tao is very, very close to what the Stoics would have called the Logos. To the point where lots of Chinese translations of the Bible translate the prologue of John, the word Logos is translated as Tao. Okay? So now Lewis could have said Logos, and he alludes to natural law. But by virtue of pointing to this Chinese concept, he's really stressing. I mean, because probably for apologetic purposes, he doesn't want this to be seen as a Christian apologetic work, right? Why he claims he's not making an indirect argument for Christianity, whether or not he is. But by stressing that this is a concept that goes into Taoism and Confucianism and well beyond anything that most of his listeners have thought about, he's saying, no, this really is universal. This really is human. And what's really intriguing is that it's not too many years later that this all plays out in China.
Okay.
Right? Because that's what happens with the Cultural Revolution. Right? This is what happens with Mao. Right?
Yeah.
His Marxism or his communism, right? His own version of it, of course, is rooted in, of course, what Ricoeur would call the hermeneutics of suspicion, which I was trying to refer to earlier, right? That's criticism without the Tao to anchor you. Right. So you can deconstruct everything and view everything as a manifestation of economic and political oppression, right? Well, then you wipe all that out and you start from scratch. Which is what Mao attempted to do, right? And therefore, if we can define human nature by the way we order society and order our political and economic system, well, then we can basically create the new man, which is what ensues in China afterwards. And what's really intriguing, and I say this as someone who lived in China for 4 years, is how that hasn't exactly been reversed, but obviously in the 90s there was the reversal of the economic policy, and since then there has been a qualified recovery of the culture. Right, the institutions that China sets up all over the world to build goodwill are the Confucius institutions, right? And I mean, when I was on tour in Beijing, my tour guide didn't disown Mao, but she's like, oh, we all agree Mao went too far. Right, like he was responding to abuses, but he was a bit crazy, and now and they're very happy to celebrate the Temple of Heaven and all, and kind of recover that. So it's like a beach ball that's been pressed under the water, right, and it pops back out or something like that, right? So this abolition of man, this abolition of objective meaning, and attempt to build everything from scratch plays out in China. That's why it's so intriguing. It's dare I say prophetic that Lewis uses this Chinese concept, when what he's talking about is going to play out pretty closely in China itself, right? Where the whole cultural heritage will be scrapped, which means the anthropological heritage is scrapped. And that leads to the biggest dystopian experiment of the 20th century, apart from the Soviet Union. Right?
Or North Korea.
Well, that's not as big. That's not nearly as ambitious, right, as the Chinese project.
Yeah, I mean, the body count should never be forgotten. That the Cultural Revolution is the scene of the most human deaths, period.
Absolutely, right. And I mean, Lewis doesn't even, I mean, again, it may seem like a stretch to go from a textbook on English to the mass human extinction that took place in China. But I mean, it's so interesting that does seem to be exactly what played out. What you call the forgetfulness of the Tao, right, in China resulted in, as you said, dystopia, from which they haven't fully recovered. So
yeah, absolutely. And that well, historical materialism, right, which was the guiding force behind that. I mean, I think you're talking about there's some recovery and so forth, but I mean, just from my limited exposure, I think it's still a full effect, and that you have these incentives for social rewards and what schools your kids can go to, and where your place is going to be in society. So I think the technology or the technate, right, is there and still in full swing for manipulating society, or really abolishing it in mankind, in that sense that Lewis is talking about, where the well, maybe we can get into it, but it's nature absorbs man, right? So it seems like she's about to surrender, and her arms come out and draw us in, and we become absorbed into it. So what actually is taking place? Is it is it a recovery, or is it a furthering? Are we going further down the road of the erasure of what it means to be one of us?
Well, this goes to the fact that every value comes from the Tao, right? So, for example, here, this is what you hear a lot of criticism about art, right? Classical art is that it's sort of aristocratic or something, right? These are the most beautiful, ambitious works of art. There's kind of an elitism to them, right?
Yeah.
And by virtue of that, there's a kind of oppression to them.
And
we should kind of, and you can see this in modern art, the kind of rejection of that, or an attempted rejection of that, which creates a new elitism in itself, right? Because only the elites can understand.
What? I don't understand.
You need
okay.
5
Sure,
paragraphs
but
of academic speak in order to understand what's going on.
Of course, yes. Gosh, academia creates its own elitism, but the idea that we ought to be concerned for those who are oppressed and marginalized and excluded is one that comes from the Tao. Right, it's something that we have an intuitive pull towards, right? Not just a purely intellectual one. Again, the intellect is often what leads to elitism, and not necessarily a gut reaction, because sometimes our gut reacts badly against the oppressed. I think a lot of us have had that experience. When we see people who are homeless or something like that, right? It's actually our instinct, it's our moral sentiment that tells us no. If someone's been informed ultimately, we'd say by Christianity and all that, but that's the instinct that tells us no. The fact that people are oppressed and excluded is a problem that ought to be fixed. But then scrapping the whole infrastructure of the Tao, right? Because it's inherited down from the system that had problems in it. It's, as Lewis will say elsewhere, it's like sawing off the branch from the tree that you're sitting on.
Yes. Yeah.
And in fact, just to pick on one point that you said, it was implicit in the background of your discussion about China. A lot hinges on what kind of political orientation you take up here. So one of the passages that comes up, I just was looking for it now, in That Hideous Strength, which is a novel, for those who haven't read it, the protagonist of the novel is named Mark, and he's pulled into this group in this little English college town called Nice, N-I-C-E. Sounds nice, doesn't it, right? But in fact, we see something very sinister as part of this project. It looks like it's just a group dedicated towards the expansion of scientific knowledge and inquiry. It's a progressive institution in that sense. But what Mark realizes as he figures out more about this organization is that the most important things that it has within it isn't its size of research grants or fancy new scientific equipment, but quoting here, it would have its own legal staff and its own police. The real thing is that this time, says the proponent here, we're going to get science applied to social problems and backed by the whole force of the state. And that's exactly what gets his recruiter excited. He says, this is the main question at the moment: whose side one's on, obscurantism or order. It does really look as if we now have the power to dig ourselves in as a species for a pretty staggering period to take control of our own destiny. If science is really given a free hand, it can now take over the human race and recondition it, make man a really efficient animal. Man has got to take charge of man. That means, remember, that some men have got to take charge of the rest. I mean, that is the not just the political side of it, right? That is the implications of the kind of materialist revolution that took place, in China in the 1960s and in the West in the 60s and ongoing, right? That kind of attitude, and we have to see that behind it it's not just some kind of abuse of power or vague language like that. It's actually a particular transformation in the way we think the goals of learning are: to take control and to re-educate, for man to take control of man.
Right, which Lewis draw this out, but it's a usurping of the human story by an elite, right? So it's those who do get to make up the laws and enforce with the chief police and enforce the power. Those are the ones who belong to the Borio, and they're the ones who get to control the levers and then therefore dictate how everything else is going to play out for us in the final analysis. But
well, and this goes to the point that I think a totalitarian society has to make a choice then. Because what I mean about China is that eventually they've realized that if we want to stay ahead, we can't just be economically ahead. You know, like when they liberalize their economy in a qualified way, but we need to be culturally ahead. So there have been a lot of classics programs actually in China, which are very intriguing, including the study of Carl Schmitt, who I've not forgotten to ask you about our enemies, our committee enemies. But of course, the point there is that they want to keep it under control. It's not for the sake of being opened up to the eternal truths that are conveyed in these classics. I ought to bring you. I bought some copies actually. My copy of Utopia is from. I have a copy of 1984 that I bought in China. Actually.
Okay. Yeah.
But the problem is for them, can you contain that? Malcolm Muggeridge talked about that. How he knew people from Soviet Russia who had never seen a Bible but were converted from reading Dostoevsky.
Okay.
Right. So. As opposed to a 1984 where they go whole hog and are like censoring poetry because any allusion to God, which is interesting from an atheist like Orwell, potentially opens up that door, right? Like, so they're trying to go for a full erasure of the Tao with all the catastrophe that involves. Somewhere like China and I guess Russia, because Russia ultimately wanted to assert its own sovereignty. So you don't want to get rid of Dostoevsky. That's the best argument for Russian cultural supremacy there is keeping a great writer like Dostoevsky. But what that means is you have to smuggle in his Christianity by accident, right? And I think this is also related to modern education, right? Where like, can you even read someone like Dante or Shakespeare without getting a glimmering of the Tao and ultimately of Christ in some way?